Assalamualaikum dan selamat sejahtera. Anda bersama saya Nabilah, Khaleeda, dan ini Niaga AWANI. Seperti biasa pada jam ini kita akan berikan laporan berita bisnes, kewangan dan juga ekonomi dalam negara dan juga luar negara. Jadi kita mulakan dengan perkembangan ini. Syarikat Takaful Malaysia Keluarga Berhad atau Takaful Malaysia mencatatkan peningkatan pendapatan sebanyak 19%, mencecah 980.6 juta ringgit bagi suku pertama berakhir 31 Mac 2025. Ketua Pegawai Eksekutifnya Nur Azman Zainal berkata, prestasi itu menunjukkan peningkatan sebanyak 154.6 juta ringgit berbanding 826 juta ringgit yang dicatatkan dalam tempoh sama tahun lalu.
Menurutnya, peningkatan utama pendapatan didorong oleh caruman yang lebih tinggi dan memberangsangkan daripada segmen perniagaan kredit kumpulan. Jelasnya, bagi suku pertama berakhir 31 Mac 2025, syarikat telah mencatatkan keuntungan sebelum zakat dan cukai sebanyak 151.1 juta ringgit, lebih tinggi berbanding 150.3 juta ringgit yang dilaporkan dalam tempoh sama tahun lalu. Tambahnya, perniagaan Takaful keluarga syarikat juga menjana pendapatan sebanyak 608.2 juta ringgit bagi suku pertama 2025 dengan peningkatan ketara 35% berbanding 449.6 juta ringgit dalam tempoh sama tahun lalu. Ia disebabkan jumlah caruman lebih tinggi dikenakan untuk pelindungan Takaful sebanyak 93.2 juta ringgit dan pelepasan caruman lebih tinggi sebanyak 44.3 juta ringgit. Segmen Takaful Am syarikat itu mencatatkan pendapatan sebanyak 343.5 juta ringgit bagi suku pertama dalam tinjauan. Mengulas lanjut, Nur Azman berkata Takaful Malaysia terus mengekalkan prestasi pada suku pertama 2025 didorong oleh kekuatan portfolio perniagaan. Tambah beliau, mereka turut mempergiatkan usaha mengukuhkan perniagaan dalam segmen runcit dengan matlamat menyediakan penyelesaian perlindungan menyeluruh kepada rakyat Malaysia. Azman berkata Kaoosji, platform dan jenama digital syarikat terus mengukuhkan kedudukan pasaran serta mencatatkan hasil positif dengan menawarkan pelan perlindungan dalam talian yang mampu milik dan mudah diakses.
Baik, perbincangan seterusnya adalah berkenaan dengan berita antarabangsa yang dikeluarkan semalam di mana Mahkamah Perdagangan Antarabangsa Amerika Syarikat pada Rabu menghalang pelaksanaan tarif import yang diumumkan Presiden Donald Trump dengan menyatakan bahawa beliau telah melampaui kuasa diberikan undang-undang. Dan panel 3 hakim di mahkamah tersebut menyatakan tarif yang dikenakan atas nama Hari Pembebasan melanggar kuasa perdagangan termaktub di bawah Kongres dan tidak disokong oleh Akta Kuasa Ekonomi Darurat Antarabangsa IEEPA. Jadi untuk kita tahu atau bincang lebih lanjut mengenai apa kesannya kepada dunia dan Malaysia khususnya, kita akan bersama dengan Imran Yassin Mat Yusof, Ketua MIDF Research. Imran, kalau kita lihat keputusan Mahkamah Amerika Syarikat ini mengekang kuasa Presiden dalam menetapkan tarif secara unilateral. Jadi kita nak tahu, adakah ini sebenarnya titik mula kepada pembentukan semula tata kelola perdagangan global yang lebih berimbang kalau kita lihat pada ketika ini?
Assalamualaikum dan selamat pagi. Mungkin secara permukaannya apabila ruling ini dikeluarkan, nampak seperti ada penyelesaian atau kesudahan di isu tarif ini. Tapi kita perlu ingat ini baru satu lapisan mahkamah. Pentadbiran Presiden Trump sudah membuat rayuan kepada keputusan ini. Semalam pun kita lihat Mahkamah Rayuan telah memberi pause kepada ruling ini. Dan selepas itu ia boleh dibawa ke lapisan mahkamah all the way up to ke Mahkamah Supreme lah, Mahkamah Tertinggi Amerika Syarikat. Di samping itu, pentadbiran Presiden Trump juga boleh menggunakan cara-cara lain untuk mengenakan tarif. Perlu kita ingat tarif yang dikenakan kepada China di beberapa sektor tertentu. Akhir sekali, Kongres masih lagi boleh mengenakan tarif. Jadi ruling ini cuma mengatakan punca kuasa tarif terletak di tangan Kongres Amerika Syarikat. Jadi secara kesimpulannya kita boleh bernafas lega tetapi untuk seketika sahaja.
Kalau kita lihat sebelum ini apabila Donald Trump mengumumkan timbal balik tarif pada April 2025 yang lalu, banyak blok-blok ekonomi ataupun rundingan-rundingan strategik telah pun dibuat, terutama dalam peringkat ASEAN dan juga contohnya seperti CPTPP, RCEP dan ASEAN Plus 3. Jadi mungkin bagaimana ketidakpastian terhadap asal tarif Amerika Syarikat pasca ruling ini bakal mempengaruhi rundingan strategik yang seperti yang saya sebutkan tadi, Imran?
Kami berpendapat ia akan menguatkan lagi kepentingan bukan saja untuk Malaysia tetapi rakan niaga lain untuk memperkukuhkan FTA dan perjanjian perdagangan yang lain. Apa yang dimaksudkan adalah untuk melihat bagaimana boleh mengukuhkan dagangan untuk kegunaan negara rakan kongsi yang lain. Ini akan mengurangkan kebergantungan kepada pasaran Amerika Syarikat. Pasaran Amerika Syarikat masih lagi penting, tetapi dengan ketidakpastian yang disebabkan oleh tarif, negara lain perlu lihat bagaimana perlu menggantikan kehilangan permintaan di Amerika Syarikat. Jadi ini sepatutnya akan menguatkan lagi rundingan dan sebagainya, dan kepentingan untuk kita rakan lain untuk berdagang antara sesama sendiri.
Dan bagaimana ketidaktentuan ini juga mempengaruhi dari segi dasar dan polisi, mungkin setengah syarikat mungkin, ataupun dari segi PKS, kalau kita boleh bagi contoh, telah orang kata bersedia untuk menghadapi kesannya dan ataupun cushion the impact. Jadi bagaimana dengan pentadbiran ataupun pengumuman yang baru ni boleh kita merubah sekali lagi dari segi dasar dan polisi dan juga strategi jangka masa panjang itu?
Jadi satu pengajaran adalah apa yang kita lihat di Amerika Syarikat ialah apabila Trump mengenakan tarif, banyak syarikat-syarikat, lebih lagi PKS di sana akan menghadapi masalah. Jadi satu pengajaran yang kita boleh lihat atau pasti yang kita boleh belajar daripada sini adalah memastikan syarikat di Malaysia, lebih lagi PKS, tidak bergantung kepada satu negara, bukan saja untuk bekalan, tetapi juga sebagai pasaran. Kalau kita lihat yang mahkamah ruling yang dibawa oleh mahkamah di Amerika Syarikat adalah berpunca daripada peniaga kecil membawa kes ini ke mahkamah tersebut. Ini disebabkan bekalan untuk perniagaan kecil ini datang daripada China, dan mereka melihat bagaimana dengan tarif barang mereka akan tidak lagi kompetitif. Jadi untuk Malaysia, kita perlu merangka dasar perdagangan yang lebih inklusif, di mana kita lihat bagaimana lebih lagi PKS perlu ada pasaran yang baru dan juga mempelbagaikan rantaian bekalan mereka.
Berkenaan dengan era tarif diplomasi, adakah ia semakin berakhir pada pendapat Imran, dan bagaimana Malaysia boleh manfaatkan ruang ini untuk kita posisikan semula diri dalam rantaian nilai global?
Mungkin belum berakhir lagi lah. selagi tiada tanda noktah di Mahkamah di Amerika Syarikat. Dan seperti dikatakan tadi, Kongres masih lagi boleh mengenakan tarif. Jadi threat of tarif tu sentiasa ada kat situ. Jadi bagaimana Malaysia boleh lagi relevan atau menguatkan lagi posisi kita ialah dengan menunjukkan kepentingan Malaysia dalam rantaian nilai global. Sebagai contohnya, umpamanya kilang iPhone dipindahkan ke India dari China kerana tarif yang lebih rendah. Jadi Malaysia perlu memastikan bahawa ia masih lagi sebahagian daripada rantaian nilai itu. Ini dengan memastikan efisiensi dan menaikkan produktiviti dan sebagainya. Lagi satu cara adalah dengan bergerak ke paras yang lebih atas lah dalam rantaian nilai, apa yang kita katakan move up the value chain lah, seperti sebagai contoh kepada IC design dan sebagainya.
Kalau kita lihat tindak balas yang ataupun respons yang positif di Amerika Syarikat, dan di Malaysia juga bertindak balas secara positif terhadap keputusan mahkamah ni. Jadi kalau kita nak tahu, Imran, sejauh mana Malaysia mampu kita nak tukar momentum ni menjadi peluang untuk kita tarik semula aliran pelaburan langsung asing FDI?
Pada pendapat kami, ketidakpastian itu masih ada lagi lah. Seperti saya cakap tadi, selagi tiada titik noktah, mungkin syarikat akan masih lagi bersikap berhati-hati dari segi ke mana mereka akan berlabur dan sebagainya. Tetapi jika Malaysia boleh membuktikan kita boleh buka pasaran yang baru atau memperkukuhkan pasaran selain daripada US, ia akan serta menguatkan kedudukan di rantaian nilai global. Kami percaya momentum FDI akan berterusan. Ini kerana jika ada pasaran baru, umpamanya kita boleh lihat mungkin syarikat-syarikat MNCs akan ada production facilities di Amerika, tetapi ada juga di Malaysia untuk serve market-market yang lain lah, seperti ASEAN dan sebagainya. Jadi ini perlu dilakukan jika kita mahu masih lagi menarik FDI Jadi kita perlu membuka pasaran baru, memperkuatkan pasaran dalaman kita sendirilah juga.
Mungkin ada juga persoalan ataupun cakap-cakap yang berkenaan mengapa pengumuman ataupun keputusan mahkamah ini dilakukan lebih kurang sebulan lebih selepas pengumuman Donald Trump timbal balik itu diumumkan oleh Donald Trump sendiri, ataupun kenapa tidak dilakukan lebih awal sejurus selepas 2 hari bulan April itu ataupun tarif timbal balik itu diumumkan. Mungkin Imran boleh jelaskan.
Dia satu antara sebabnya keputusan ini mungkin boleh dicakapkan di 1 bulan selepas Trump, 1 bulan lebih lah, dekat 2 bulan. Ini satu kerana ia perlu ada kes yang dibawa ke mahkamah. Jadi ia perlu mengambil masa untuk mungkin syarikat atau apa yang kita lihat Attorney General daripada beberapa state di US juga membawa kes ini ke mahkamah. Jadi mereka perlu mengumpulkan kes mereka lah, atau proses untuk pelantikan lawyer, peguam, proses untuk mengumpul data, maklumat dan sebagainya. Dan ini perlu dibawa ke kes itu ke mahkamah, dan ada satu set date untuk mereka berbicara di mahkamah, dan kalau tak silap saya dalam 2 minggu mereka berbicara baru ada ruling. Jadi proses mahkamah ini akan mengambil masa lah. Jadi dia perlu ada seseorang atau satu kumpulan untuk bawa kes ini ke mahkamah lebih dahulu sebelum mahkamah boleh membuat satu ruling lah.
Jadi apa yang Imran boleh katakan di luar sana ataupun pengajaran yang boleh kita ambil kepada semua sektor-sektor yang terlibat dengan tarif perdagangan ini? Mungkin apa yang boleh kita lakukan ataupun dari segi merangka dasar perdagangan yang lebih inklusif mungkin, dan juga mungkin dari segi merangka dasar yang lebih responsif terhadap industri secara keseluruhannya?
Dia antara dasar-dasar yang kita perlu lihat, seperti saya katakan tadi, satu, of course, secara short termnya kita perlu lihat bagaimana untuk mengurangkan tarif jika tarif itu masih lagi dikenakan, untuk mengurangkan tarif supaya barangan kita masih lagi kompetitif dan kita masih lagi boleh mengeksport ke Amerika Syarikat, kerana Amerika Syarikat adalah satu pasaran yang masih lagi penting. Tetapi di samping itu, Malaysia juga perlu lihat bagaimana untuk membuka pasaran baru. Di sini di mana perjanjian perdagangan seperti RCEP, CPTPP, ASEAN Plus 3, ASEAN, AFTA dan sebagainya, dan FTA yang ada adalah amat penting kerana ia membuka ruang untuk syarikat-syarikat mengeksport barangan mereka ke negara-negara ini. Kita juga perlu lihat bagaimana kita boleh memperkuatkan consumption of barang-barang yang dikeluarkan oleh negara-negara rakan niaga lah, dan juga Malaysia lah. Maksudnya sekarang ni kebanyakan barangan dieksport ke Amerika Syarikat kerana pasaran itu agak lukratif lah, consumption yang amat tinggi. Tetapi kita perlu menaikkan juga consumption di negara seperti China, rakan dagangan kita dan sebagainya, supaya kita tidak bergantung kepada satu pasaran sahaja. Dan ini perlu rundingan yang lebih mendalam, lebih komprehensif di antara Malaysia dan rakan niaga mereka yang lain.
Baik, seperti yang Imran katakan, pentadbiran ataupun Trump sendiri telah membuat rayuan ataupun memfailkan rayuan. Jadi sama kita nantikan keputusan Mahkamah Amerika Syarikat nanti. Dan terima kasih sekali lagi diucapkan kepada Imran Yassin Mak Yusof, Ketua MIDF Research. Baik, seterusnya Bursa Malaysia menongkah arus aliran serantau untuk ditutup lebih rendah pada Khamis apabila tekanan jualan dalam saham wajaran tinggi perbankan terpilih melembabkan sentimen dengan ketiadaan pemangkin domestik baharu digandingkan dengan kumpulan keluaran pendapatan korporat yang tidak memberangsangkan. Dan pada 5 petang semalam, FTSE Bursa Malaysia KLCI atau FBM KLCI turun 4.50 mata atau 0.29% kepada 1,518.98 daripada 1,523.48 ketika ditutup pada Rabu. Dan saya akan tunjukkan pergerakan ataupun prestasi FTSE Bursa Malaysia KLCI untuk setakat hari ini. Pada jam 9.02 pagi, kalau kita boleh lihat, ia berada pada paras 1,521.11. naik 0.14% dan 2.13 mata. Jadi kita akan lihat prestasi FTSE Bursa Malaysia ini dalam jangka masa seminggu bermula pada hari Isnin. Kalau kita dapat lihat, ia dibuka pada paras tinggi iaitu sekitar 1,534.72, namun memasuki hari Selasa ia turun sedikit 1,529 dan hari Rabu ia menunjukkan penurunan dan peningkatan yang agak mendadak. Penurunan hampir mencecah 1,500, kalau sekitar 1,522 ataupun 26 dan naik sedikit sehinggalah ke hari Jumaat ia ditutup ataupun dibuka rendah pada kadar lebih kurang 1,520 dan ini adalah bagaimana FTSE Bursa Malaysia KLCI untuk sepanjang minggu ini. Dan seterusnya berkenaan dengan ringgit, di mana ringgit ditutup rendah berbanding dolar Amerika Syarikat pada Khamis apabila mata wang Amerika Syarikat itu meningkat selepas Mahkamah Perdagangan Amerika Syarikat menyekat kebanyakan tarif yang dikenakan oleh Presiden Donald Trump ke atas import ke negara itu. Dan pada 6 petang, mata wang tempatan susut kepada 4.2390 atau 2475 berbanding dolar Amerika daripada 4.2215 atau 2275 pada Rabu. Baik, saya akan tunjukkan pergerakan ringgit untuk setakat hari ini 30 Mei 2025. Kalau kita boleh tunjukkan pergerakan ataupun prestasi ringgit itu untuk setakat hari ini 30 hari bulan adalah lebih kurang 4.2289. Kita dapat lihat kalau kita bandingkan dengan hari sebelum ini, dalam lebih kurang 26 hari bulan, ia lebih kukuh berbanding 30 hari bulan dalam sekitar 4.226. Dan untuk penonton faham, apabila graf itu menurun, nilai ringgit itu mukuh dan apabila graf itu menaik, nilai ringgit itu melemah. Dan ini adalah disebabkan seperti yang saya tekan tadi, adalah kesan ataupun faktornya adalah impaknya daripada keputusan Mahkamah berkenaan dengan tarif yang dikenakan oleh Donald Trump, Presiden Amerika Syarikat, dan tarif itu telah disekat ataupun diblok buat masa sekarang dan rayuan pun telah dibuat tapi keputusannya akan kami nantikan selepas ataupun nanti oleh Mahkamah Amerika Syarikat dan banyak lagi akan kami kongsikan selepas ini dan kita akan teruskan dengan perkembangan seterusnya. Alright, US stocks ended slightly high on Thursday, May 29th, as shares of Nvidia gained after its quarterly results, while investors digested a late afternoon court ruling that reinstated the most sweeping of President Donald Trump's tariffs. The S&P 500 gained 23.62 points, or 0.40 points to end at 5,912.17 points, while the Nasdaq Composite gained 74.93 points, or 0.39%, to 19,175.87. The Dow Jones Industrial Average rose 117.03 points, or 0.28%, to 42,215.73.
The market is still digesting kind of the back and forth on the U.S. court blocking the Trump tariffs. That's kind of been the story this entire year. Is it's been tariff ping pong, for lack of a better term, and we saw a lot of exuberance immediately after that court blocked it. Now there's news coming out today that, well, the White House is almost certainly going to challenge this. Also, there's still going to be tariffs in place. It's not like they, evaporated. So I think the market is, just consistent with, trading on tariff news is starting to ratchet that back a little bit. I don't necessarily see that as a bad thing, especially given the kind of the strength that we saw, early morning in the futures and then yesterday as well. If anything, I think the bigger story, honestly, is NVIDIA, with the beat that they had and, just the signal that sends for, kind of broader strength and, what has been the kind of the main growth sector for equities of recent.
All right, there was a statement by the Chief Investment Officer, Ben McMillan, and right now we want to break down what's happening in the US stock market. And behind me is Standard & Poor's 500 index stocks categorized by sectors and industries, and the size represents the market cap. And there's a mix of green and red over here, and green means gains and red means losses. And I'm going to start with NVIDIA. As per mentioned earlier, NVIDIA shows a green color. It was up and increased by 3.25%, and the stock cap price market right now is 139.19, and the latest updates on NVIDIA is NVIDIA beat quarterly sales expectations as customers stockpiled its AI chips before fresh US curbs on China exports took effect, but the same restrictions will slice off $8 billion in sales from the company's current quarter, forcing the company to offer a forecast below Wall Street estimates on Wednesday. And shares of the world's most valuable semiconductor firm still rose 5% in extended trading as investors digested news that the heat in the current fiscal second quarter was not as bad as feared. And Nvidia talked up demand for its new Blackwell chips from customers, including Microsoft. The stock is relatively flat so far this year compared with 2024, when the shares nearly tripled in value. Nvidia now faces trade restrictions on what it can sell, and the AI data center market is also maturing. Next is Google. As you can see, Google shows sort of almost a red color, but it was down by 0.29%, and the stock price right now is 171.86. And the latest update on Google is Germany is considering a 10% tax on large online platforms like Alphabet's Google and Meta's Facebook. Its new Minister of State for Culture told magazine Stern, in a move likely to heighten trade tensions with the Trump administration. And the proposal comes as Chancellor Friedrich Merz is expected to travel to Washington soon to meet with US President Donald Trump, although a trip has not yet been officially announced. And Trump has in the past said he will not allow foreign governments to appropriate America's tax base for their own benefit. Next one, I'm going to show you under the sector or segment of consumer cycle or auto manufacturer, where Tesla, it was up by 0.43%, and the current stock price is 358.43. And the latest update on Tesla, where Elon Musk break with the Trump administration, means investors will hope he refocuses on his sprawling empire as Tesla battles slumping sales, and after SpaceX's latest rocket launch fell short of expectations. And Musk called time on his White House stint on Wednesday, giving Tesla investors some succor after shares slumped this year, in part due to the backlash to his support of US President Donald Trump and right-wing parties in Europe. And the billionaire also spearheaded Trump's so-called Department of Government Efficiency, charged with cutting federal spending, which generated controversy. And moving on is we have Amazon. Amazon right now, let me find Amazon over here, and it was up by 0.48%, and the current stock price is 205.70 green color, and where the New York Times is allowing Amazon.com to use its editorial content for artificial intelligence products such as Alexa, marking the publisher's first licensing deal tied to generative AI. And the multi-year agreement lets Amazon use news articles from The Times and content from NYT cooking and sports website The Athletic, the publisher said on Thursday, without disclosing the financial terms of the deal. The deal comes as AI companies strive to overcome difficulties in improving their large language models after exhausting all the easily accessible data in the world. And many, including ChatGPT owner OpenAI, are also facing lawsuits related to data usage. All right, we have more Update Saturdays. Don't go anywhere. Please stay tuned with my colleague Tehmina Kaoosji.
Hayati semangat pengorbanan dan keindahan Aidiladha.
Membicarakan perihal ibadat dan berita haji.
Ilmu-ilmu yang mana kita dapat tu insya-Allah kita kongsi-kongsikan.
Peranan ibu bapa untuk mendedahkan tentang umrah dan haji ini sangat-sangat penting.
Ikuti perkongsian ilmu dalam Bual Bicara Santai.
Hari kasih sayang, pengorbanan dan juga keinsafan yang disatukan.
Situasi ini sebiji ketika haji. Nanti bila buat ibadah haji, mudahlah.
Cuaca yang sangat panas.
Apa benda saya buat semua saya seronok je.
Saya memang rasa macam terapuk.
Drama penuh tauladan dan inspirasi yang menyentuh jiwa.
Abang ingin sekali bisa pergi naik haji bersama keluarga.
Nasib baik Mak hidup. Mak ada kawan. Nasyidnya kena lembut, kena lunak.
Lagu-lagu rock banyak lagi unsur-unsur Islamik.
Sambut Aidilladha dengan penuh keinsafan dan kebersamaan.
Salam Aidilladha. Indahnya lain macam.
5 lelaki penghantar makanan didakwa di Mahkamah Magistrate Bangi atas tuduhan membunuh seorang pemandu kereta lelaki dalam satu kejadian.
4 sungai di sekitar kawasan perindustrian Pasir Gudang di Johor termasuk Sungai Kim Kim didapati tercemar dan berada pada tahap yang membimbangkan. Kerajaan sudah mulakan inisiatif untuk menggantikan kenderaan operasinya kepada kenderaan elektrik EV dalam skala kecil terlebih dahulu.
Daulat Tuanku.
All right, thank you for tuning in to AWANI. And right now, we'd like to revisit a key partnership that could actually further energize Malaysia's startup ecosystem, which the recently signed Memorandum of Understanding MOU between Zoho and also Cradle Fund. And Zoho is now a key technology partner of the My Startup platform, aiming to empower local startups with world-class tools, mentorship, and also pathway to global scalability. And with over 18,000 startups in 40-plus countries already supported through the Zoho for Startups program, we want to know, what does this mean for Malaysia's digital future? And joining me right now is the Vice President and General Manager of Zoho Asia Pacific himself, Jibu Matthew, virtually to hear from Zoho's perspective. Perhaps we could start with the big picture. We see that startups often fail not due to the lack of ideas, but because of poor execution. So how does this MOU with Cradle aim to help Malaysian startups overcome real-world operational bottlenecks and technological pain points Malaysian startups face today?
Thank you for having me on the show, Nabilah, and thank you for that very interesting question. First of all, I would like to share our partnership with Cradle, right, through the My Startup platform, is actually designed to be to ensure that technology is an enabler for a business and not a barrier for business. Because many a times in the past, we see that technology doesn't get used within the organization, and that is one of the challenges that businesses and startups face. Well, the harder part is today the levels of digitalization that has happened across functions in an organization. What that means is there are so many tools, and startup founders and ecosystem businesses actually find it difficult to actually put all these tools together into a functioning operations tool for their teams. Well, that's where Zoho as a technology, a suite of technology products built on the same platform brings a big difference for the ecosystem. Well, if you look at how Zoho does things, we started off as a startup ourselves, and we believe we still run like a startup at heart, even though we are like close to 20,000 employees globally. Well, when you look at how we have built our tools, we have built it up from the ground up, which means we have built it on the same technology platform. The tools share the same backend. It's built on the similar technology, which means when we come out with tools like, say, a CRM or finance tools or HR tools, they all run on the same backend, and everything is built from the ground up and never actually bought and stitched together. That gives us an advantage to make the user experience for an organization to actually get started. So I think those are actually fundamental aspects to make sure that technology is an enabler rather than a barrier for an organization to get started. Well, what that means is we are trying to create real value at the operational level for the startups so that they can actually focus on building on the ideas that they have.
And let's have a reality check, Jibu, where in today's fast-moving environment, especially post-COVID, startups are also navigating compliance, data security, and also rapid scaling. So how do your tools actually cater to startups in regulated or fast-evolving sectors, regulated industries like fintech and also health tech, for example?
Right. So when you look at regulatory and compliance, okay, especially when you're a software as a service, the advantage what a startup business gets is the SaaS provider or the cloud solution provider takes the responsibility to facilitate those compliance, for example, on your behalf, be it from security perspective or data compliance perspective. So when we roll out solutions, we make sure that our tools are compliant in the markets it operates. We make sure that for example, from a security perspective, we ensure that we have the best practices in terms of cybersecurity practices, be it from the back-end side or best practices on how organizations should implement those security practices within their teams. Because if you think of it, right, a lot of times, especially when it comes to security, right, the weakest link in the chain of security users or the users who use the tools is people. So we actually bring in best practices in terms of how tools have to be balanced in terms of security and compliance versus user experience for the employees who use the tools. So we bring in those best practices, our learnings from a global perspective, and we distill it in a way that is easy to use for organizations to get started and not be overwhelmed. And in addition to that, right, say for example, we have some basic fundamental principles on which our organization runs, be it in terms of how we run our security practices, or more importantly, in the recent times, I would say data privacy, right? So when we came out with support for GDPR, maybe it's over like 5 to 7 years ago, for example, when GDPR was, we supported GDPR, it was not specific to just Europe. So our CEO actually announced that we would be GDPR compliant in spirit and in action globally, right? So we have been making sure that privacy is actually a very fundamental aspect, how we run and take design decisions. So when we build tools, we keep these things in mind so that we are compliant. We do not have, for example, an advertisement-driven business model also in our tools. So which means when our designers, when our developers, when our architecture designers and architects work on our tools, we make sure that those best practices are put into place right from day one. And it has been done historically, which means today when we look at how AI and generative AI is so common, if you look at it, AI makes sense only when there is a lot of data. And this is one thing we assure our customers also, wherein we have taken the best practices for at least a few decades, and we are actually even ready for that AI age wherein you need to have more data, even more data to make better decisions. So we are in such a position because of the basic principles on which our organization has been running. And for example, as I mentioned, we are GDPR compliant globally. We focus on ensuring data sovereignty and other best practices needed, which means a lot of defaults in our product, in how we handle data, in the capabilities we provide on our products and our platform products, they actually come with good defaults, which can be tweaked by the organizations on a need basis to make it even more stricter if needed. This is all to ensure that, as an organization, they should focus on growing their business. And we provide the right tools and knobs in our applications and products and platform services so that an organization can be compliant wherever they run as a tool.
Mm-hmm. And indeed, cybersecurity and also data privacy has always been the main concerns for startups especially. But many early-stage Malaysian startups especially are built by small, non-technical teams. So how intuitive and adaptable is Zoho's low-code platform for founders with little coding background to create or actually customize the solutions they need?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, especially for startup founders. So when you look at, it's also an interesting keyword that you used in terms of low-code platforms. So when you look at products and solutions, right, in general, startup founders have a lot of ideas they have to chase, but they need aspects or tools to support and make those actions or business processes efficient. And that is where low-code platforms help you. Well, Zoho's approach to low-code is quite, I would say, scalable and different. We have a core product called Zoho Creator, which is a low-code platform. Well, the advantage about low-code platform is you don't need to have a software developer itself to build a full-blown application. You do not need actually an application developer to build a mobile app for your business. Well, you could just do some clicks in a web browser and even build a web app, an iOS for Apple devices or Android app for other Android devices. Well, all that you could do it right from a browser. Of course, if you add a few developers to it, you can make it even more complex or comprehensive. However, these low-code things are actually an important trend, especially where organizations have newer generation employees who have been exposed to technology in the early days of their education. So what we are seeing is a new breed of new generation employees who are joining the workforce who have been exposed to a lot of technology from quite a while, which means today you also have people what we like to, or the industry calls citizen developers. These citizen developers can be a transforming force for the organization because citizen developers can add a lot of value to your organization because they spend a lot of time understanding your business process. Your experts have already trained them on your business process. Understanding the business process is one of the hardest things for an external person. Well, if your citizen developers can understand your domain and then also work on tools or like low-code platforms, like, for example, Zoho Creator, they can actually build amazing applications. Now, Zoho's approach to low-code is the low-code platform layer is there across many of our products, be it our customer relationship management application called Zoho CRM, or our customer support software, or our project management solution, or our accounting platform, or our Zoho HRIS information system called Zoho People. It's actually ubiquitous across 20 different applications in Zoho itself, which means, well, you get that powerful customization capabilities in individual applications also, or you could actually build something from the ground up completely out of the box. And that's the beauty about low-code as a technology. And this is actually very important, especially for early stage startups. I would say, especially with lean teams. Sometimes it is not about, it's not about having the 100% of the problem solved, because solving 100% of the problem could take years maybe, but maybe it's about getting 80%, 90% done and finishing off the rest of it on your way or towards the next couple of years. The beauty about low-code platform is your teams can collaboratively build that application iteratively over time, even as you get more learnings. And that's the best thing about low-code as a platform. And our approach to low-code being in our own platform products also.
Mm-hmm. And besides being a low-code platform, I like how Zoho tailors its support for high-growth verticals, like, for example, fintech, health tech, and also green tech, beyond just offers just generic productivity tools, because we know the digital adoption right now remains uneven across sectors. But Jibu, as startups scale, they often outgrow their initial tech stack. So in your opinion, what's Zoho's approach to actually ensure continuity across the startup journey from MVP stage to regional expansion without forcing costly rip and replace transitions?
Yeah, so when you look at the startups, like, for example, verticals like health tech, green tech, if you look at some of these verticals, right, a lot of even fintech, for example, right, for example, they are the most advanced in terms of technology adoption. Right? So they may not want just a basic tool, but they will want something that is able to keep up with their innovation. When you look at, normally the banking and finance sectors, they adopt technology quite fast. Similarly, technology that is applied in consumer tech, right? For example, your social networks and other aspects, they also adopt technology quite fast. Now, these are verticals or industries where they actually adopt technology faster. And what they need is they need tools that are able to keep up with what they do. Now, when you look at tools that we provide, for example, we give a lot of things by default with best practices that we learn globally in our tools. However, as I mentioned in the previous statement about low-code platforms, our products are not just configuration capable, but you can even customize it with low-code. You can even customize it with professional code, which means you could write entirely software code from the ground up and drop it into our application to make it even more dynamic. So which means it actually scales according to the needs of the business. And be it whatever be the industry vertical, well, it actually supports that model. For example, if you look at fintech startups, right, they could leverage Zoho Books for real-time financial tracking. It's not just about fintechs, obviously. Zoho Books can be used by business SMEs and other businesses also. They could build custom workflows, maybe with our low-code platform creator to facilitate some specific use case that they have. And each of our tools actually become much more powerful and are flexible. And it actually is an enabler in an industry agnostic way. And the most important thing I would say is, it's not just about digitizing workflows. It's also about how you can empower a startup to customize their tools for their specific needs, because that is what, at the end of the day, improves the user experience for their employees. And when you build tools, you want your employees to use it day in and day out and be productive and creative for your organization. And that's where our ease of use of our tools come into play.
But Jibo, in your opinion, Malaysia aims to be a regional startup hub, and especially with the ASEAN-wide initiatives on digital trade, also data interoperability. So how can actually Zoho's ecosystem support local startups in accessing cross-border markets, especially when handling digital exports or complying with international regulations, in your opinion?
Sure. So if you look at Malaysia, is not just aiming to grow into a startup ecosystem. It's also, I guess, positioning itself to be a regional digital launchpad, right? There's quite a lot of initiatives, like, for example, the Malaysia Digital Economy Blueprint or the My Digital program and the Malaysia Startup Ecosystem Roadmap for 2021 to 2030, right? There's a clear roadmap to build a digital economy. And there is quite a lot of interesting government support also to facilitate that for startups. Now, what is actually needed is, for example, right, let's say Malaysian startups want to go beyond Malaysia. They want to go regional, right? Or they want to go, they want to support going regional or global, right? So they will need, for example, multi-currency accounting or cross-border payment integrations. For example, Zoho Books could support accounting in so many countries globally, not just a specific country in one or two countries, but we support quite a lot of interesting countries globally. That is there. Other aspects in terms of being GDPR compliant, if you are trying to go into Europe, for example, how we handle and provide best practices in the tools actually make it a lot more easier for organizations to go global. Well, if you look at our collaboration with Cradle itself, it's about equipping, say, founders, not just for the local market, but actually for regional playbooks. We are embedding this kind of a mindset early on, right? So we do we do have a lot of hands-on workshops and topics on various aspects that help specific types of businesses or broad set of SMEs also to understand how to use technology to facilitate their work to be done better. And in short, they're not just helping, say, Malaysian startups to scale up. We are actually also helping them to scale out of their comfort zones.
Like you mentioned, it's not just for scale up, but it's for scale out as well. So with your collaboration with Cradle, we know that startups don't just need capital and they need talent, also tech capability. So does this partnership with Cradle include mentorship and also upskilling or perhaps capacity building support for founders and their teams?
That's an interesting question. So Yeah, definitely. So a lot of things that we do a lot of interactive sessions, we do a lot of panel discussions, we facilitate a lot of educational activities, we work with different organizations in different places in Malaysia itself. For example, we do a lot of events in, say, not just in KL, but in Sarawak, in Penang, in Ipoh, in other parts of Malaysia, where we actually do educational events to help an organization to learn more about how technology can enable them, right, in terms of going global. Now, when you talk about skilling, especially when it comes to technology, right, we see how technology is an enabler. Technology is also a disruptor. So if you see in the latest few years in terms of how generative AI itself is playing out, right? So technology is possibly disrupting even the people who build technology, which is generative AI is even disrupting software developers, as we see in the news today. So technology is something that is changing and changing quite fast. So the fundamental tools that you use in an organization should facilitate creativity and collaboration. So our tools, for example, facilitate collaboration and learning within the organization. We have products like Zoho Connect that helps you to create functional and cross-functional teams and groups and conversations and facilitate creativity and ideas to bubble from the bottom up. Previously, typically creativity used to be from the top down only. But today, with how technology has kind of flattened decision making, we believe that creativity is now all in all the team members. So we build tools to facilitate that so that ideas can be shared across team members. That is actually a very important aspect. And our applications and tools facilitate collaboration across our tools, across our applications, not just across employees, but you can even collaborate with your external partners and suppliers, whatever be your industry you work in. So those are very important aspects, especially when you're trying to go global or go regional, and when you're working with environment which is fast changing, not just in terms of technology, but where things are changing even in terms of compliance, and where you need to make quick decisions. Well, enabling those tools make it easier for every team member to make those qualified decisions, to make your organization a lot more agile. So in general, I would say the mindset of a founder should be about, it's a very critical aspect, right? It's a very critical role, how the founder itself of an organization works, where technology, and typically technology should be a long-term enabler. That is how founders have to look at tools. And that's an important thing which we feel Zoho as an organization, we like to support that kind of a thinking with an integrated, scalable platform that can adopt to the business's digital transformation journey.
And looking at drawing from your work across more than 10 countries, Jibu, in your opinion, what actually moves the needle for startup adoption of digital tools? Is it government policy and also digital infrastructure, or actually something more cultural like founder mindset?
Well, I think all three are equally important. As I mentioned about the mindset of the founder is also very essential. I would say the policies are also a game changer, especially interesting policies that have been rolled out in the recent times. We have the e-invoicing itself happening even as we speak in Malaysia. Well, that actually helps businesses to be actually more bankable. If you look at it, you have better accounting practices. And when you're more bankable, what that means is you're able to get credit from you have a better credit rating, and you are able to get more finance to run your business more and scale out your business, right? So that is an important aspect. And especially when it comes to technology today, technology has become just like as important as air and electricity, for air for humans and electricity for a business to run. Without good digital infrastructure, your creativity is not going to be, you're not going to be able to maintain the creativity. Well, so that's actually an important aspect. And we have seen, Malaysia's this Jendela initiative. It's aimed at expanding the broadband accessibility and 5G rollouts, which is actually very essential. So yes, these are very important aspects. Policy actually kind of gives a subtle push to the organization so that they actually speed up their transformation, especially when you see a lot of tools being used in the consumer world, and when government services are more digital, that will also encourage small businesses especially and other larger businesses to transform themselves. Because today, for a local business itself, your competition is not that the next door physical business out there. Your competition may actually be somebody who's sitting global thousands of miles away from you, who can actually deliver something to your neighbor's house or to your neighborhood within hours. So that's also the competition we are seeing today as a small business or a medium business. Now, how do you transform that, right? So you transform yourself by actually enabling your business to have those best practices and best tools, and you provide that infrastructure. So the government providing that infrastructure helps these startups to think beyond their neighborhood. That's when they go regional or global. So these, the policy, the digital infrastructure, and the mindset of the founders actually go a long way, especially when the founders think digitally, I would say digitally native founders, when they think end to end, that's going to be a transformational factor for organizations to scale out.
But moving forward, before we end this discussion, Jibu, in your opinion, or how do you foresee the toughest emerging challenges that you foresee for startups in this region for perhaps 5 to 10 years? And if you can explain on how is Zodoho planning to keep up and also lead in enabling these next-gen founders for them to thrive sustainability across borders, in your opinion?
So when you look at the challenges for the next 5 to 10 years, I would say I'm sure the challenges will change in 2 years, right? So I'm not able to predict for 5 to 10 years because of how AI itself has transformed, I think, almost everything that we have seen, right? For example, even Google search, as we see, which was almost similar for the last 25 years, right, is set to change completely, right? So we are going to see, one thing is for sure, we are going to see a lot of changes happening and going to change very fast in the next 5 years to 10 years. And these are going to be fundamental changes on how businesses itself run and how they'll have to organize themselves. Now, when you look at technology itself being an enabler, that is something which is very essential for an organization. And startup founders have to keep that in mind even as they plan their startup growth. Well, fundamentally, they have to stick to their basics. They have to stick to and identify those niche areas that they can succeed in, but keep their eyes open on what innovation happens in adjacent spaces and adopt that as early as possible into their spaces or into their domains so that they are able to be more creative. Now, in the next 5 to 10 years, you will see AI transforming every job function, right? Be it in accounting, you will be seeing a lot more accounting practices getting much more easier, but the bar will be raised even more higher. The more technology is used, it doesn't mean that there is less work. What's actually going to happen is we will see better experiences. Experience is not really tangible or measurable easily, right? But people will start to expect some things to be that way. If your business doesn't provide services in a specific manner, well, what's actually going to happen is your customers are going to go to your competition or whoever is doing innovation there. So it's not that you're going to lose business with AI, but you're actually going to go out of the market if you don't be creative enough. So that is the way to think when it comes to technology adoption. So keep your eyes and ears open, adopt technology, build the right framework so that you're able to continuously keep yourself relevant.
So as Malaysia continues to build out its startup ecosystem, founders' mindset and also partnerships between public and also private sectors players will be key to addressing real challenges where in operations, for example, we have talent development or market access. So I would like to say thank you to Jibu Matthew, the Vice President and General Manager of Zoho Asia Pacific, for your time also perspective. And you can find this whole discussion on all of our social media platforms, and that includes Astro, AWANI.com. I'm Nabilah Khaleeda. Thank you so much.
Uniform Tentera Darat Malaysia TADM bagi peserta program latihan khidmat negara tidak seharusnya menjadi isu hangat.
Jenayah penipuan pelaburan mencatatkan jumlah kerugian tertinggi pada tahun ini setakat 2 Februari lalu.
Kementerian Pendidikan memandang serius isu peningkatan trend penggunaan rokok elektronik.
Lembaga Lebuh Raya Malaysia LLM memperluaskan larangan kenderaan berat memasuki lebuh raya pada waktu puncak di beberapa jajaran terpilih di sekitar Lembah Kelam.
Dah lama aku pendam benda ni. Kini telah tiba masanya.
Assalamualaikum. Nak itut boleh?
Semua orang ingat kau dah mati, Boran. Kau dapat peluang start balik. Lepas tu ini kau boleh.
Tariffs on imports of products from China reaching up to 145%.
Tariffs on the rest of the world are sitting at 10%, with the potential for reciprocal tariffs to be reimposed within 90 days.
Kunjungan rasmi Presiden China ke Malaysia ini menunjukkan komitmen kedua-dua negara untuk meningkatkan hubungan diplomatik ke tahap yang lebih strategik.
Hello and welcome to Niaga Spotlight with me, Tehmina. Kaoosji. Niaga Spotlight goes through the week in economic analysis and future affairs. Well, this week we're diving into on analysis, #diplomacy. But first, of course, the ASEAN Summit took centre stage through this week across Kuala Lumpur, with Malaysia taking cruise control as ASEAN chair in 2025. Now, with all things tariffs, trade disruptions and shrinking growth forecasts being in sharp focus, Niaga Spotlight delves into the timely topic of #diplomacy, US tweets and ASEAN shifts. So we examine a powerful and surprising layer of American policy making, one that's not found in official legislation or closed-door committees, but rather in retweets, hashtags and quote posts. Yes, we're talking about Congress's digital battleground. Now, according to the latest Spheres of Influence report from Penta, one of Washington's top public affairs firms, the way lawmakers are using X, formerly Twitter, has evolved into a sophisticated, often polarized tool of political influence. Now, this is more than messaging. It's momentum building, base activation, and even agenda setting. Why should this matter to business leaders and policymakers in Malaysia and across ASEAN? Because what trends on Capitol Hill's feeds today may become trade policy, tech restrictions, or even ESG mandates tomorrow. Now, understanding how influence is built and battles are fought in Washington's digital trenches is critical for anticipating policy shifts as well as protecting regional business interests. Joining us to unpack this is someone at the center of it all, Brian DeAngelis, partner and head of Penta Group's Washington, D.C. office. A former U.S. Senate strategist and leading voice in media and public affairs, Brian helps Fortune 500 companies and global leaders interpret and shape U.S. policy narratives. Brian, welcome to Niaga Spotlight. Thank you very much for making time. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me.
Fantastic. So let's dive right in, Brian. Now, your report, of course, reveals that Republicans and Democrats are using X, formerly Twitter, in increasingly divergent ways. How are these digital strategies signaling not only partisan divides, but actually pretty fundamental approaches to governing from Penta's research and work?
Yeah, we're seeing both parties use the power of social media to, as you said in the intro, really galvanize their base. In the Republican side, you're seeing it as a way to connect their support, to show they're in line with President Trump's message. They know that's an important platform and channel that he pays attention to. And on the Democratic side, you saw back in our Q4 report, really Democrats start to move away from X. It was a little bit of a protest of Elon Musk's influence in the White House and with President Trump. But they came back very strong in Q1 because they understand that is where news is breaking. That is where their base and Americans are going to get information. And they know they can tap into the power of social media in the sense of the anger, the frustration, the viralness of the content to really start to build their support, both legislatively, but also back on the campaign trail, whether that's small dollar donations or just starting to build up the grassroots support.
Exactly. Now, I think it's really interesting how Penta's research, and also just as a journalist who's also a user of X, you can actually notice the downtrend of Democrats' presence on Twitter versus Republican policymakers, right? So it's super interesting that this partisan messaging divergence is coming out quite clearly. Now let's shift into what this might mean and what lessons perhaps ASEAN executives might take away from all this which is happening online in real time.
Well, it's another proof point of how democratized American politics has become. It's really become a new almost sport for Americans. They do follow it. They do get excited or frustrated, but either way, they bring a lot of energy to these debates. And it's platforms like Twitter that produce that bite-sized information that they can get at any point on their phone, as opposed to traditional media where you're sitting through reading the article or listening to the podcast or watching the cable news show. So folks know that's where they can go, and that is where corporations from ASEAN nations, or even a lot of what we advise in the United States, you can tap into that same energy, both for your own intelligence of what's happening, what's moving way before it hits, the newspapers, if you will, or you can start to put your own message into that conversation and make sure both Americans and then the politicians that are chasing the same conversations online see your positions, understand where you stand on some of these topics.
Exactly. And of course, the research is also showing that clearly both Republicans as well as Democrats, they're sticking very much to what their party narratives are. Republicans, for example, really have been focusing on topics like immigration and crypto when it comes to what they're doing on X. Democrats, meanwhile, what they're saying on X primarily concerns healthcare, tariffs. And are you seeing that, given that the platform itself is primarily looking at X itself, Brian, what about the disinformation and that quite often blows out maybe the proportionality of the importance of the topics being discussed versus also all the disinformation in the mix because of the way in which the algorithm has changed and so many other shifts governance-wise for X?
Yeah, there's two ways to look at the power or influence of a platform like X. You understand it through the legislative and what I'll call the DC politics of it, which is the minute-by-minute update on where information is flowing, who's up, who's down, where a piece of legislation. We just saw this in the last week on our big domestic policy bill that went through the House of Representatives, that real-time information of how things are breaking down, a tremendous amount of influence. What a lot of folks need to be careful of is not to get lost in that when it comes to campaigning and understanding that side. Yes, it helps a lot with the base, but there are millions of Americans that are working every day, that are focused on their families and their lives. They're not checking X for the minute-by-minute update. They're not as plugged into it. So we often refer to it as the Washington bubble, but you can get sucked into the X bubble as well and really misunderstand what some of the rest of the country might be feeling on these issues.
Absolutely, and I think we echo with that very deeply here across ASEAN and even in Malaysia, where, for example, in Malaysia we might refer to it as perhaps the Putrajaya bubble, or even just generally the X, or even the Facebook bubble, right? Okay, so digging deeper and moving on, Brian. Now, one of the most surprising findings that came out of your Spheres of Influence report is the emergence of unconventional influencers shaping congressional discourse online. Tell me more about this.
Yeah, we've been watching this trend for in many ways, probably the better part of a couple of years, but really acutely over the past election. Americans just consume information differently. And that's not to put anything against, traditional media or the power of still, your New York Times, your Financial Times, your Wall Street Journal, or even some of the cable news programs we see, but people live online. They are living in their communities. So we're seeing more and more of these influencers, these individuals, whether that be journalists or podcast hosts or activists, really start to build communities around themselves and be able to drive messaging and policy decisions or the momentum behind those decisions in a way we really haven't seen before with traditional media. Many ways they're not bound by the rules of traditional media. So they're pushing opinion, they're pushing a point of view. They don't feel obligated to be two-sided, of course. And that's where we are starting to see them really come to the top of the list of what members of Congress are following, who they're engaging with. It's those same influencers.
Exactly. And of course, digital influencers can then move on into actually perhaps even shaping policy discourse when it comes to not just the kind of conversation that is generated, but perhaps zooming into the ASEAN and Southeast Asian landscape. Brian, do you feel there could be an opportunity here for Southeast Asian stakeholders then to engage with American policy indirectly, perhaps through media or even advocacy partnerships from what you're seeing?
I do. I think there's opportunity. I mean, the first is almost an obligation to understand how the American media environment and information environment is changing. And if you're not staying up to date, up to speed on where those changes are happening, you can find yourself running a playbook that's been out of date now for a couple of years. So I think there's first that almost, duty and responsibility to have the right intelligence, and then understanding where you can engage. We often call it the white space, but where is there a spot in this conversation where either as a country, as a partnership, as a region, or maybe as an individual company, you can insert your voice in a credible, authentic way, knowing through the intelligence that you will receive some appropriate amount of support and engagement from those audiences.
Absolutely. I think it's something which has shifted in the landscape, perhaps most distinctly in just the past 6 months alone. So clearly a lot more attention needs to be paid. Now, the Penta's report, Brian, also outlines top issues which are dominating American lawmakers' online messaging. So from your vantage point, which of these issues would it perhaps be? Maybe tech regulation, China policy, or energy transition? Which of these might actually end up having the most downstream impact on ASEAN economies?
In some ways, I want to choose all of the above, but I do think everything kind of starts and ends with China policy. I mean, it is an incredible priority and focus for President Trump. We've seen that he can have what in my opinion is a very rash approach to how to negotiate on some of the things that may be a priority, not only for him, but even some in the Democratic Party. He takes a very, very aggressive negotiating stance, and that's going to have ripple effects both across the U.S. economy, but also across the Southeast Asian economies. I think that creates both downside risk in terms of the connections to China and how the president views some of the partnerships within the region. It also creates, I hope, a lot of opportunity. And you have seen some talk over the past few weeks of essentially a new trans-Pacific partnership in some ways. I don't think this administration will call it that, but another attempt to create some sort of trade partnerships stronger relationships for the U.S. in the region that helps buffer what they see as China's power and influence.
Absolutely. Now, of course, American lawmakers have been intensifying their discussions. Sectors which are really vital to ASEAN economy, semiconductors, critical minerals. And I think we await with bated breath once the 90-day tariff pause actually runs out and what's going to come at the end of that. At the same time, when we look at more key issues a little bit longer term, like energy transition and geopolitical dynamics, what are some opportunities for perhaps American policymakers to also stay ahead of the game? Because the truth of the matter is that China globally is actually one of the biggest investors when it comes to clean energy, particularly in the ASEAN and the wider South Asia region. So there is also a chance for America to get ahead of that, regardless of the current administration's perspectives, perhaps, towards energy transition.
That's right. It's critical, I think, for American policymakers, frankly, across both parties, to really understand the long-term implications of Trump's approach to not only foreign trade, but really foreign partnerships and foreign policy in general. My sense of this, and you've seen evidence of it, is we are by default empowering Europe and empowering Asia to start to think about themselves more as a bloc that has a lot of influence on the world, to not just rely on their relationships with the United States. That's going to have some lasting impact for the U.S. in terms of how we engage with the world, how we think about trade partnerships, defense partnerships, as you said, energy and climate change partnerships. So there's opportunity there to really think about, as Europe or Southeast Asia and other regions start to stand up more, how can we do it in a way where we're still a partner, we're still working very closely with them, and avoiding maybe some of the adversarial damage that, you know, really could come out of the way Trump is approaching foreign policy.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for your perspective so far, Brian. Most insightful. We take a short break now. We'll be right back with Niaga Spotlight.
Perusahaan kecil dan sederhana, impian besar. Jiwa SME Astro AWANI kembali menjelajah Malaysia. Dari Ipoh ke Kota Kinabalu, dari Melaka ke Lembah Kelang. Sesi pitching, pameran produk dan dialog bersama pemimpin industri serantau. Dapatkan inspirasi, ilmu dan peluang untuk kembangkan perniagaan anda, semuanya di bawah satu bumbung. Kerana inilah medan impak sebenar. Jiwa SME menjana impak, inovasi digital.
Kini, kita nantikan whistle yang seterusnya untuk membuktikan kemampuan kita. Setiap keraguan menjadi keberanian. Setiap cabaran adalah suatu peluang. Sekali anda saksikan kehebatan, anda pasti tidak sabar untuk yang seterusnya. Nantikan aksi Harimau Melaya secara langsung di Astro Arena, Arena Bola dan Astro Go.
Gempur di AWANI 7.45.
Welcome back to Niaga Spotlight, still with me, Tehmina Kaoosji. And on today's show, we're discussing #diplomacy, a look at Penta's Spheres of Influence report in deeper detail and connecting it back to trade headwinds, tariff talk and everything happening in ASEAN and beyond, particularly in this crucial week as the ASEAN Summit wraps up in Kuala Lumpur. Brian, so getting back into the discussion. Now, looking at the fact that American politicians are so much more increasingly using social media, not just to communicate policy, policy, but to also build ideological loyalty and fundraising pipelines. So does this point towards a blurring between governance and brand building?
Oh, absolutely. I think we've been on this trajectory for probably a number of years here, and you see it with what I call these viral stars. I mean, in many ways, it probably did start with President Trump. Maybe you could make an argument for Barack Obama, but you're watching as candidates from both the right, the Republican Party, but even the Alexandria or Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, as she's known here in the US, Bernie Sanders, they are tapping into movements first through social media and first through that constant updates of content and engagement and reaction to those items that they know are going to go viral online, that they know Americans are getting fired up about. And they're making a name for themselves. And it's not a separation in their mind of when am I campaigning, when am I acting as a member of the United States Congress. It's one and the same. It's building up these super brands that you've seen around some of these politicians. And that translates into both a big reputation among the base, but it also makes you kind of public enemy number one on the opposition side, because again, the viral nature of it. So we're seeing it. I think we'll see more of it, at least more attempts. And really those candidates that are able to do it well will rise to the top of some of the candidate lists.
Clearly, and perhaps at the same time, it may also be prioritizing personal or party branding over perhaps bipartisan governance. This could be some issues to look at, but I think a lot of the same is actually happening around not only ASEAN, but also within the Malaysian political sphere. But perhaps looking at the impact on the predictability for ASEAN stakeholders who are also observing all of this rollout in real time on American social media. Some thoughts on that, Brian?
Yeah, it's going to be difficult as things change so quickly. But to my earlier point, to stay ahead of these movements, to stay ahead of, really which member of Congress or members of Congress are the quote unquote rising stars at the moment, you have to have a good intelligence and operation kind of looking at channels like X, understanding those movements almost in real time, I would say, understanding both what is motivating that conversation too. A lot of what we look at Penta is not what the members of Congress are saying. This report obviously being the end of that research for us, but what are the influencers of that members of Congress saying? What are the influencers of those influencers saying? Where does this conversation start to bubble up? And are there opportunities to both monitor that and start to see around the corner of issues coming? And as I said before, for countries or regions to start to put their messaging out there earlier in the process before we have that viral moment with the member of Congress.
Clearly, and at the same time, of course, identifying what the pressure points might be for certain policy-related discussions. Brian, so then perhaps I'd love to get your insights on markets like Malaysia and across ASEAN, though. Digital strategy is still often quite seen as complementary to policy engagement. In contrast, clearly, Penta's research and reports are suggesting in Washington, digital positioning is now rather central to political leverage. Is this a trend that ASEAN government affairs teams should also begin mirroring?
I would hesitate to say begin mirroring. I do think this is a challenge for a lot of American politicians, because what they often find is the ability to go viral, to put that digital strategy first, to really build that base. And then as their careers advance within Congress, they find themselves truly in the positions of power, as if being a chair of a committee, for example, with a major piece of legislation. And then to something you said earlier, they have to start acting a little bipartisan to try to get the votes. They have to start to make deals and negotiate. and explaining why you made a deal and did something the way you did it to get votes doesn't quite translate into that viral moment on X. So folks find themselves kind of losing some of that momentum that they see on social media. There's certainly opportunities to get it back. This is why, in many ways, you often see the opposition party having a lot more success in moments like this. Part of what our report showed is that Democratic voice on tariffs really taking off, because we're not the ones in the position to go negotiate the deals. We're the ones that can kind of sit there and say, this is wrong, Trump's handling it the wrong way, look at the damage it's doing on Americans. And that's the type of content that takes off on platforms like X.
Absolutely. And at the same time, of course, it depends so much on public opinion. For example, if business owners, small shareholders in particular, are the ones to voice out how the tariffs may be directly impacting them, that perhaps, starts off a chain reaction of maybe even political influencers taking on the mandate. All right. Brian, so now you've also highlighted that unexpected voices are clearly punching above their weight and influencing congressional debate. Can you unpack the mechanics of that influence? And perhaps could a well-strategized ASEAN corporate or even a sovereign voice similarly enter the digital influence sphere to perhaps move towards shaping more U.S. policy narratives?
Yes, it's a bit of a formula as you start to unpack it in terms of volume of content. As I mentioned, sort of the aggressiveness of the content, you're not quite as restrained as maybe a member of Congress is or has traditionally been in terms of what you can say and the opinion you want to push out on it. It's in many ways why the media is falling further down those influencer lists, especially online, because the media traditionally wants to bring that journalistic ethics of let's tell both sides of the story, let's get to the facts. That's not the exciting stuff that fuels a platform like X. So we're seeing these very aggressive, almost full-time posters get out there, tap into those heated conversations, put themselves out there as the expert on it or the agitator of it. And that attracts more and more followers, which in turn creates more viral moments and creates more followers. And you fall into this formulaic cycle that puts some names that we wouldn't have seen a year ago, even 6 months ago, at the top of the list of the people driving these debates.
It's a very interesting intersection of, cultural timing, meme fluency, as well as emotional charge. Yes. And that's exactly what makes a lot of these traditionally non-expert voices actually rise to the top of the list. It's absolutely fascinating. I think what we're moving towards is perhaps an era of evolving algorithmic diplomacy. Would you agree with that?
I would, and on top of that, to your last point, you're losing some of the substance and policy expertise through that process. The folks who used to have the influence had decades of experience on an issue. They understood both sides of the issue, and even if they had a strongly held belief on one side, they could figure out parts of the other side where they were willing to negotiate or find compromise. You don't have to do that online. You don't have to go deep on it. You don't have to really even understand the substance. You just have to understand what's going to make more people mad or excited or angry about it to get more followers and more attention.
Yes, absolutely. Now, I can see the opportunity for perhaps if a Southeast Asian, let's say a sovereign wealth fund or a tech conglomerate would take the opportunity to frame a policy message, perhaps as a values-based, shareable narrative. Things like this may actually have the potential to perhaps go viral in the online atmosphere that we've actually helped to foster of late. Perhaps one last area before we take our leave, Brian. Now, let's talk about the quiet power of what's not being said. So based on your data, which key economic or geopolitical issues impacting ASEAN are perhaps notably absent or underrepresented in the congressional digital discourse?
I actually was quite surprised, even though it's on our list, of the immigration debate. And in many ways, the immigration debate right now in the US is very focused on our own borders. But what's getting lost, or at least tied up in a couple of other debates, is that immigration, whether it's through colleges and universities or work visas or, diplomatic opportunities. We had the whole Doge moment with USAID, for example. We're losing a moment where that cultural exchange can happen, where in our sense, we're hopefully pulling some of the best and brightest from different countries to come to America to understand our culture, to work in our companies, maybe go to our universities, invent the next great product, and vice versa. The Americans that go over to Asia or Europe understand that part of the world, bring that back to their workplaces here or their government jobs. I think that's going to be a big issue to many of the things we talked about today in terms of the lasting ripple effects of what's happening right now. And it's not being talked about. Again, it's not probably really that ripe content for viral moments on X. But if you really dig under the surface on 3 or 4 of these issues that we are seeing picked up, that's a big factor that we're keeping an eye on as well.
Absolutely. I think we take for granted on the tail end of, 80 years of largely peaceful global relations, what that kind of brain circulation has actually meant for global economies, including, of course, America's and wider ASEAN. Brian, it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you so very much for your insights. We wish you all the best at Penta, and thanks again for joining us on Niaga Spotlight.
Thanks for having me.
Well, that's all we have time for today on Niaga Spotlight. I'm Tehmina Kaoosji signing off for now, and we'll see you again next week with more economic analysis and insights. Here's to a productive week ahead.
Adik, kan apa Papa cakap?
Malaysia pada ni bermula dari langkah